So here's an example face frame. This is an example that we're going to look at building today. And this face frame is going to be attached to the front of the project. Now the face frame does a couple things for our project. One, it adds some strength because this frame makes the box stronger as it's glued and attached to there. And two, it's going to cover up any plywood or other core materials on our project. So if we look at this project, I have the project turned around, and this is what the front of the cabinet would look like without our face frame on the other side. And we have this plywood or core material that we would want to cover up. And so the face frame, as we attach that onto the front of the cabinet, covers that up so we don't see any of those plywood layers. Okay, the other thing it does is add strength. So as this project gets moved around, maybe from house to house, or moved around from living room to bedroom or wherever it may be as you're moving furniture around, the face frame adds strength to the box so that it doesn't lose its shape and kind of work loose the joints that are holding it together. Now in the cabinet making world, they do make a frameless cabinet, and that's where the cabinet itself has either some edge banding or a piece of solid lumber glued onto the front of the cabinet. Now when we talk about cabinets, they usually are mounted to the wall, and so a kitchen cabinet would not necessarily need a face frame because once it's attached to the wall and the surrounding cabinets, it's not going to lose its shape, it's not going to have stress on the joints from being moved around. So in the cabinet making world, frameless cabinets are okay, but ideally in furniture and other things like that, the face frame is really going to add some strength to the cabinet. All right, we're going to start building our example nightstand, and we're going to start today by building the face frame because the face frame typically dictates how big the project's going to be. So if we take a look at our plans here, our overall height is 28 inches, and our overall width, if we look at our plans here, is 12 inches. So we're going to create the face frame so that our project ends up this size. So if we look at our face frame, we have 5 parts. We have our bottom rail, our center rail, and our top rail. So we have 3 rails and 2 stiles. Stiles are on the side, rails are going side to side. Okay, so our top rail and our center rail are the same. They're going to be 1.5 inches wide, according to the plans. And our bottom rail is going to be 4.5. Our stiles are going to be 28. So we need 2 pieces at 28 inches. And then we're going to need 3 pieces that are about 12 minus 3, so about 9 inches long, 9.5, depending on how much room we're going to have extra to cut. So let's go start cutting our work pieces down to size and getting a board and getting that logged in. So we're over here at our wood rack and we're getting ready to pick out a piece of material to start with. We're going to be starting with our solid lumber. So we have any of these pieces on the end here. Right now they've got a red end painted on them. It could be a different color. It's just whatever our wood supplier has colored that pallet so they can easily tell what it is at the mill or in storage or in stock down at the lumber yard. So don't worry about what the red end means. If it's blue or if it's black, that's fine. Don't worry about the color. You can come up here and pick a board. Remember, our solid lumber comes in random widths and lengths. So there's wide boards, there's skinnier boards or narrower boards. The thickness should all be the same on these, and we get our material in at 15/16 thick. So grab a board, whatever one's going to meet your needs, really doesn't matter. So if we take a look at this board, we do have a little knot here. And we order this material in a grade that about 90% of the board is good. So there's going to be some kind of defect in it, whether it's a knot like this or a wane edge or whatever it may be. The board is graded for about 90% good. Now if we went with 100% good, that board cost jumps up quite a bit in money. So to save us some money, it's cheaper for us to cut around our defects and use this wood than it is to buy the premium wood and use more of it. So that's why you're going to see some defects in there. Plus it is a natural material, so there's not going to be a perfect piece. The colors are all going to vary. The grain patterns are all going to vary. So it really doesn't matter which one you want to grab. They're all going to have some different imperfections with them. So once we've picked our board, we're going to take it, we're going to go over to the log computer, and we're going to log it into the log book for marking it down. So I've got my board here. We're going to take some measurements. We're going to measure how long and how wide the board is. So lengthwise, we can take one measurement all the way down to the end and measure. Now remember, each board is going to be different. So we need to be accurate to the nearest 1/16 of an inch as we are measuring. Now on the width side, what I would recommend doing is measuring in 3 spots. You're going to measure on the end. So this is about 8 5/16. We're going to come to the middle. This is 8 7/16. And we're going to come to the far end and measure. And down here we're getting 8 3/8. So we're varying within about 3/16 on the length of this board. So we're going to take the medium or the average size, which would be the 6 3/8, and that's what we're going to enter into our logbook. So this board's going to be entered as 6 3/8 wide by 98.5 inches long. So we're going to come over to the logbook, which is here, the little workstation at the window here. You can wake that up, and in the middle of the screen you will see there is a logbook icon, and that logbook is what we're going to be using to enter in your material today. Now that we've got our material entered into the logbook, we're going to take this over to the sliding miter saw, and we're going to cut this down to size that we need. So let's head over there. All right, we're here at the sliding miter saw, and this board is brand new from the lumber mill. Hasn't had anything done to it yet. Still has a colored end on here. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut off about 1.5 inches to 2 inches off the end of the board, and we're going to try to make sure any cracks. You can see some cracks in here from the different seasonings or drying periods that it's had. And so if it wasn't seasoned or dried properly or too fast, it could crack. So we're trying to get rid of any of those cracks because they're only going to get worse with time. So I'm going to come up here, line up my board. It doesn't have to be an exact science on this. We're going about 2 inches, and we're going to cut that off. Make sure your board is tight against the back fence. If it's not, if you have a big gap, then you need to flip your board around. So I'm going to hold on to this and make a cut. So now we have our factory edge here we've cut off. We got rid of that crack that was in there. There might have been some more cracks and maybe we can't see. There is a little bit of a defect here from that defect in the wood where that discoloration is. But what I'm going to do is take this piece and lightly tap on it. And as I'm tapping on it, if it stays solid, it's good. Now if I smack this hard enough, because of the grain pattern here, it will break. But if I just lightly tap the material and it doesn't break, we're good. There's no cracks that we need to get rid of or anything like that. Now these defects that we see here on our board, we can cut around those as we get going. So if it's not if it's a crack that comes in here further, rather than cut that much of your board off and have that be waste, what we'll do is we'll just cut that section of crack out later on. So what we're trying to accomplish here is mainly getting rid of these little tiny fine hairline cracks that are from the drying or seasoning. You can see that big one. There's a little one right in there. Maybe you'll not be able to see on the camera. So those are what we're trying to get rid of in this process. What we're going to do now is do our rough cutting. So what we mean by rough cutting is rather than take this whole 8-foot board through all of our machines to get it straight, we're going to rough cut it to a rough size. And typically that means 2 inches larger than we need. So if we take a look at our plans again, our stiles, which are our 2 longest pieces, are 28 inches long. So I'm going to take and I'm going to cut this piece to 30 inches. That gives me 2 extra inches for squaring up the board after I run it through our joiner and table saw and get everything straightened up. So we're going to rough cut at 30 inches, and I'm going to only be using 1.5 inch strips so I can get multiple pieces out of here. So I only need 1 piece at 30 inches because I can get my 2 stiles out of there. So take your tape measure and your pencil. We'll go ahead and mark this out to 30 inches. I'm going to come into my 30 inches and make a mark, okay? And I'm going to line this up and make my cut. So I'm going to pull down the saw, get it lined up to my marking on there, and I want my mark to be on the other side of the blade because this is the piece I want 30 inches. So my mark is down in there. I'm just going to get that lined up. If you can't see the marking, it is down there right next to the blade. Okay, I've got that lined up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the vent on the machine, and it's going to turn the light on and the vent over here in the corner to help with dust management. So I'll turn that on, and now we're going to make our cut. So there's my 30-inch piece. So back here looking at our plans, we just cut our stiles to 30 inches. Now we need to cut our rails. We have 3 rails. They're all going to be the same length. And the length is going to be 12 minus 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches. So 12 minus 3, their finish size is going to be 9 inches. Now 9 inches is too small to run through our machines. So what we're going to do is we're going to add 2 inches back on, which would be 9, 10, 11, and 11 is still too small for our machine, so we're going to bump this up to 12 inches. That we have to add on an extra inch so that we make our minimum length for our machines. So we're going to lay out on our board 12 inches, and that should be enough to get us 2 or 3 of our rails here. So let me lay that out. Taking my pencil, coming to the 12-inch mark, and making a mark on the board. And again, we're going to slide that mark down so that the saw blade is on this far side. So as I bring the saw down, my mark should be on this side of the blade because this is my good side. And we'll cut this off. Should have waited till that stopped before I brought it back up so it's not scraping on the way back up. Now this rest of this board, okay, we're going to have more parts that we need to make later on. So we want to write your name on here, big letters, so that if you set it aside, there's no mistake of whose it is. So okay. So we got our name written on here. So as we set this over in our storage area, little Johnny comes up to see if whose board is whose over there. He can very clearly identify whose board it is. We're going to save this for later in a project for our other pieces. That way our grain patterns and our colors kind of match our first original pieces. So you can put this in your storage area, and we're going to work with the 2 pieces we just cut off. When our materials come in from the mill, they are cleaned up on the 2 faces. The 2 edges are still rough. They still have rough factory edges on there, saw blade marks. They were not straight. If you remember, we measured our board and it was 6 5/16 on one end, 6 7/16 in the middle, and 6 3/8 on the end. So it wasn't straight. We want to take and get straight edges on our board. So we're gonna come over here to the joiner and we're gonna run our pieces through the board. We're gonna run our boards through the machine. And so we're gonna do that. Remember, our main objective here is keeping our workpiece tight against the fence so it stays 90 degrees and down along the surface so it doesn't get a rocking edge on there. So we'll go ahead and turn this on. So we've now ran both of our boards through the joiner to get a nice clean edge on each board. The factory edge is now gone, or the milled edge, nice and straight and cleaned up. Now just because we jointed this does not mean our sides are parallel to each other. Okay, we could have a straight line going like this and a straight line going off like this, and they're not parallel, but they are straight. So what we need to do now is get these straight. And the way we're going to do that, or get them parallel, and the way we're going to do that is with the table saw. Before we go there though, one thing I like to do is after I'm done joining, I like to put a little X on the side that I jointed. That way I know which side, after I start cutting these apart, has been jointed. So anytime I see that X, I know that that is a jointed, straight, and true side there. So we'll go ahead and put a little X on those. So later in the process, when we need to know which side was our jointed edge, we can use that. So now we're going to go to our table saw and do some rip cuts. So we're here at the table saw. We're going to make sure our blade height is set correctly, which it's not. It's a little too low. The teeth are not high enough. And remember, as we set this, we only want it about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. So those teeth are barely above the workpiece. Then we're going to put the guard back in place. Now that our size is set, our blade height, now we need to review our plans and see how big everything is. So everything with our stiles and rails is going to be 1.5 inches according to our plans, with the exception of the bottom rail. The bottom rail is 4.5. The reason this is 4.5 is because it goes all the way to the floor, and on top of that, a piece of trim covers that up. So as we're here looking at our example, our bottom rail here actually goes all the way behind the floor, to the floor, and it's behind this trim piece. So this is 4.5, so that this trim has something to attach to when we build it to the project. So that bottom rail is 4.5 inches, and the trim is 3 inches. So when we're done building, we still have 1.5 inches reveal above the trim, like we would have all the way around the rest of the project. So that is why that bottom rail is so big, because that trim is covering it up. So we're going to set the table saw to 4.5. We're first going to cut this 4.5 inch piece. I like to cut my wider pieces first. That way, if I forget to change the size, then I at least have pieces that are too big. If I'm cutting my 1.5 inch pieces first and I forget to change the size, I cannot come back and cut this to 4.5 if it's already cut to 1.5 inches. So I personally like to cut my wider materials first, then bring the fence in closer and closer as you're cutting. So we're going to set this to 4.5 inches. We're going to use the cursor here on the saw, and the cursor is accurate, so we're going to just set this up to 4.5. And once I lock it into place at 4.5, I'm going to come back and check and verify that it is still at 4.5 and has not moved on me. Sometimes this fence is at a slight angle, and when you lock it down, it kind of locks back and that size comes off. So after you lock the handle, check and make sure it's accurate. Now I'm going to take my jointed edge and I'm going to keep that tight to the fence as I cut. Okay, I turned it off after that use because I'm only cutting one piece that wide. The other pieces are all going to be narrower at 1.5 inches. So I'm getting these pieces out of here. I'm going to set up my outfeed table so that I can push my pieces all the way off the table. We're going to reset the fence now to 1.5 inches. And so you're going to do just like before. You're going to use the cursor. You're going to get set to 1.5 inches. And lock that down into place. Once it's locked, then come back and verify that it didn't move in the lockdown process, and make sure you're right at 1.5 inches. And again, we're going to need our push stick, so we want that ready. Now this time I've already cut off of this board, so when I cut, I want that jointed edge against the fence because I know that's my straight edge. So every time I cut or make a cut of some kind, I'm going to have that jointed edge against my fences. So I'm going to use that X against the fence. No jointed mark, so this has my jointed side. I'm going to do that against the fence. At this point, I have my pieces cut, a few of them. If I take a look, this is my 4.5 inch bottom rail. I've got my jointed edge on there still. I have my top or center rail, doesn't matter which one. I have a jointed edge on there. I have my two stiles, and I have my jointed edge marks on there. So we need one more 1.5 inch wide piece for our center rail or our top rail. Now we can use one of these boards, that's fine, but we have no jointed mark on here anymore. So we should go back to the joiner and joint this. And what that's going to do, a couple things, is it's going to make sure we're nice and straight. It's going to take any saw blade marks out of the material that might be there. So if you're able to see this on the camera, I don't know if you can, but there are some saw blade marks or hash marks going across the material, and that's from the rotation of the saw blade. So we're trying to eliminate that. It's going to save you some time later when building your project. You don't have to sand so much because those marks are already out of there. You still need to sand, but you're not going to have all these deep saw blade marks. There's a really nice one right there for you to see. It's kind of at an angle. So I'm going to joint this because we need one more piece. So because I've already cut this and jointed it, I'm only going to joint this edge once instead of twice like I did when that was still a factory edge. Because we know it's already somewhat straight, we're just cleaning up the saw blade marks and things like that. Now remember, when our board is shorter than our fence here, we need to have push sticks and push blocks so our hands don't get in the machine. So we're going to use the push shoe for this because it covers most of the workpiece the entire way. We could also use a push block on the side to keep that push tight against the fence. If this were a longer board, I'd use a push block up towards the front, and on the back side I'd use a push shoe to grab that edge of that board. So we're going to run this through and get a straight edge on this little piece. It is 12 inches long, so it does meet our minimum length requirement. I've jointed it, all of my saw blade marks are gone. I now know this is a nice straight edge. I'm going to use my pencil and put a mark on there again, so I know that that's my straight edge. Now we're going to go cut this to 1.5 inches. All right, so we have all 5 of our face frame pieces cut here, and these are our scrap pieces left over from cutting. Now, something this small, realistically, you're not going to use for anything. If you want to save it, put your name on it and put it over in your storage pile. If you don't want it, go ahead and find a trash and discard it. This bigger piece we want to save for some of our other parts that we need to make. This could maybe be used for one of our trim pieces, or this could be used for part of a door or drawer front as we get building. So put your name on there, big letters again, so there's no mistake of whose it is. And then you're gonna put that over in your storage pile. Since we have now cut these all to the right width, we've ripped them down to size, now we need to come back and cut them to the correct length. If you remember, we did a rough cut. We added 2 inches on, and that was so we could get it all straight and parallel to each other. Now we need to come back and cut the corners so they make a 90-degree shape to that original jointed side. So we're going to take these to our sliding table saw. It's going to be our most precise way to cut these. And we're going to take off that 2 inches that we have left on for rough sizes. So now that we're here at the sliding table saw, we're going to start with our stiles because they're our longest pieces, and then we're going to work our way to the smaller pieces. So our stiles need to finish at 28 inches. 28 inches is their finish size, okay? And so right now they're at 30 inches because we left them 2 inches longer, so we're going to cut them twice. The first time we're going to cut and take a little bit off of one side to square up one side. Then we're going to flip it over and cut the rest off so that both ends are square to our jointed edge. So let's get the saw set first. I'm going to come down here and set this to 28 inches. And you need to get right above it and look straight on. This does have kind of a convex top and it's magnified. So if you're not directly above it, if you're off to one side, your measurements are going to be off a little easier. So get that set correctly. Got one of my jointed pieces off to the side. I'm going to work with the other one here. That X that I had that was jointed is going to go against the fence. So I'm going to keep that tight against the fence. And as I cut it, I got to keep it supported, and we're going to run that through here. I'm just taking off a little bit. Now we're going to flip it over and cut the rest off of down here. So now as we look at this board, okay, I know which side was against the fence because I have my X, okay. Now this corner should be a nice 90-degree corner because we just squared that up and we flipped it over and did the same to this side. Now if you don't have an X on there, you're not sure which side was against the fence, One indicator is typically there's a little bit of blowout on the end, and that was the side that was not against the fence. As it came through and cut, it just tore a little bit. So that's not a bad thing necessarily, but that does help us indicate which side was against the fence if you're unsure. Now again, my first cut, okay, on this next board here, my first cut is going to be with it underneath the guard, or underneath the stop. So my workpiece has extra to be cut off down here, so it's on top or underneath the stop there. Then my second pass, after I cut that and flip it over, then my second pass is tight up against that stop. So the first stop, or the first pass, is underneath, and the second pass, it's butted up to there. Okay, so again, jointed edge against the fence. We're going to turn the machine on. So now both of our stiles have been cut. They both should have 90-degree edges to that jointed surface. So now we need to cut our rails. All three of our rails need to be the same length for this frame to be nice and square. So what I'm going to do is we want to try to have all three pieces ready to go. So all we have to do is set the fence once, make all 6 cuts on the 3 boards, and then all of them will be exactly the same. If we make one of them and then later on in the day come back and make another one, and then tomorrow we make another one, there's no guarantee that that fence is going to be exactly the same for each cut. So we want to try to make the cut once we set the fence. Now there are times maybe you make a mistake and you have to remake one of these. That's fine. But if at all possible, try to cut them all at the same time. So our size, we have an overall size here of 12 inches. We know that our face frame is 1.5 inches wide on both of these, but it's not a bad idea to check that and make sure that they are truly 3 inches total. So let's check those. And if I put my 2 stiles together and pull a tape measure across, I should be right at 3 inches. Well, looks like we're right on the money there. So that is good. So now we need to do a little math. 12 minus 3 is going to be 9. So all 3 of these pieces are 9 inches. We need to be sure that we're done working with them, because once we cut them to 9 inches, they're too small to run through our other machines. So we're going to cut it to 9 inches, and then they're too short to run through any machine. So if we have to make an adjustment to them, maybe there need to be a different thickness or something like that, then we're going to have to start with a 12-inch long piece and rework them down. So make sure your sizes are where you want before you cut these. So I'm going to set my fence to 9 inches, and I'm going to give myself just a little bit of room. I want my project to finish at 12 inches. So I'm going to add 1/8 of an inch on. That's going to give me a 1/16 on each side that I can make this face frame smaller to match up to the box. And you'll see that in a little bit when we flush trim the face frame to the box. So I'm going to make 1/8 of an inch bigger. So I'm going to set it to 9 1/8. And again, you want to be right above that. And then go ahead and tighten that down. Just like our other cuts, the jointed edge is going to be against the fence. We're going to cut a little off one side, then we're going to flip it over and cut the other sides off. That gives us 2 cuts on each board, and it's going to make our 2 corners 90 degrees to that surface that was jointed. So let's go ahead and turn the machine on and cut these. So I'm going to So now all three of my rails should be exactly the same length. Let's get all of our pieces together and take a look at them. So now that I have all my pieces cut, we're going to face them. And what I mean by face them is we're going to look, because now is the time that we're going to determine which side is their good side. So what I'm looking for is any defects, maybe any wide grain patterns that maybe you want to have towards the back of the project, okay, or towards the front side. Whatever it is that you're looking for the project to look its best. Now this does have a little bit of personal preference to that maybe one thing that looks good to you might look good, not good to someone else, or vice versa. So that is your decision, which side you think looks the best, has the best characteristics for your project. Once you've determined which side is going to be your good face, I'm just going to put an X on there so I can determine that later. Now we're just mainly doing that to the rails, but we can also do it to the stiles. When we're doing the stiles, one thing we need to be looking for is we need to look straight down the board at this top edge, and you should be able to see if it curves one way or another. Now as I look down this, I don't know if we can get you to see on the camera very well, it has a curved spot. So I'm going to want this to be my side that's down, not my good side. That way it's touching the face or the cabinet here and there, and I'm going to pull it down with the clamp in the middle. So I've got a little bit of a warp or bow there, and I'm going to put the crown as my good face. Now there are some exceptions to that. Again, we can look down this one. I think this one's going the other way, so I would make this my crown side, my face here. Now there are some exceptions to that, and that might be like this. It's got a little bit of a color variation in the grain here. Behind this red, there's a dark streak. Now if you don't want that dark streak in your project, then you could flip this over and face it the other way. Again, remember, it's personal preference. If you don't like that dark rustic look, then flip it over, that's fine. It's, again, personal preference. The main thing I would worry about when facing your boards, again, is looking down there and finding the bow and the crown and putting the crown towards the outside of your project if you can. Okay. So now that I have my boards all faced with a mark on there, I want to do a dry fit. What we mean by a dry fit is we're putting this together without any glue to make sure our size is correct. Now we know that we need to finish at 28 inches tall, and we cut those stiles already to 28, but we're just going to verify that we are 28 inches long. Now the width, we need to finish at 12 inches wide. Now remember, I did add 1/8 of an inch on, and so we should be at about 12 1/8 with our work pieces. So I'm going to put this together, dry fitting without any glue, and I'm going to pull my tape, and if I look closely here, I am at that 12 1/8 mark. Okay, right where we want to be. Now, so it's not a bad idea to check all your sizes. So we checked here at the bottom, check here at the center rail, and make sure you're getting 12 1/8, and check here at the top rail and make sure you're getting at 12 1/8. Now that we're done with that and we've dry fitted, we made sure everything's right, now we can put pocket holes into our work pieces. If we were to pocket hole the work piece before doing our dry fit and we forgot to cut something down, now that we've got these holes in here, if we have to cut some wood off of here, these holes are going to be exposed and no longer good. So if we do that, we also have no room for a new pocket hole. So that's why we're dry fitting before we put the pocket holes in, because once we put the pocket holes in, we can't cut a little bit off. We'll ruin that pocket hole and the screw won't hold. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get these ready to attach them. So we're going to attach them together like this, and we're going to use a pocket hole. And to cut our pocket holes, we're going to be using our Kreg machine here, our pocket hole machine. Now I'm going to make sure that X that I indicated is facing towards me. I have a gold line right here on the tip of the machine, and that's going to indicate the center of my hole. Now I need to get 2 holes in the end of this board. If I only get 1, when I go to attach it, it's going to pivot on that 1 screw. So we need 2 screw holes on each end. So again, this little gold colored mark in the center of this safety ring here is where the center of my line is going to be. If you come up to put your wood underneath here and it's not fitting underneath this piston or this clamp here, you need to turn the machine on. So over on the left side, there's an on switch, looks like a little light switch. Turn that on and that clamp will raise up when we turn it on. Now I need to get 2 holes in the end. So I've got 2 holes in each end, so this will not pivot. Now, when we're lining up our board, generally speaking, that gray line, we should be in about the 1/3 of the board. So if we divided this board into 3 sections, we'd want to be in this first third and the third third over here when making our marks. That will give us a little gap in between there. We don't want to have our pocket hole coming off the edge of the board. It's better to have them closer together like that than to have one exposed out the side of the board. So make sure you're lining it up. You do need to fit 2 on each board. Another thing I would recommend when drilling your holes is to drill all 4 holes before looking at your workpiece. If you drill 1 hole and pull it out and look at it and you forget which way it went in and now you put it down the other way, you're going to have holes on both sides of your board. We don't want that. So drill one end, then twist it around, drill your other end, and then examine your workpiece so that we don't get holes on opposite sides. We're going to do this to all 3 of our rails. All right, now all 3 of our cross pieces should have holes on there. Now you'll notice the wider board, I put a 3rd screw hole in, and that's just so it can tighten up better because there's more surface area along there to get closed. So now we're ready to assemble it, and so we're gonna go and do an assembly. All right, I've got all the supplies I need to put my face frame together. I got a couple scrap pieces of plywood that we're gonna use, and I've got my face frame clamp here that we're going to use, and I've got some screws and glue ready to go. I'm going to take my stile and get that laid out. We're going to start by attaching all of our rails to one stile. Now what I'm looking for is for the face frame, or that jointed edge. Okay, that jointed edge, that mark that we made, is going to go towards the inside of the project. So if I put that jointed mark out, then my rails are going to be coming and attaching to this side of that piece. That's going to make it easier when I'm done building because I don't have a rough edge on the inside of my project to sand. I have sanding to do, but I don't have all the saw blade marks. The saw blade marks are going to be on the outside of the project, which we're going to take off with a router later on, and we'll show you that when we flush trim. So that jointed mark is going to go towards the inside of the project. Okay, and then we're going to take and line up our rails and get them attached. We do want to push in nice and tight. We don't want to round the square nose of the bit. You might come up to this after a student has used it before you, and it might be kind of rounded corners and not grabbing very well. So if that's the case, if you get a bit that's got rounded corners on it, bring it to your instructor. They'll get it switched out for you. All right, I've got my face frame clamp. I've got it set so when I clamp it to this scrap board that it's nice and tight. Okay, I'm going to use this on my bottom side to make sure that that joint stays flush. So that's why we're working on this scrap piece here. And so I'm going to use a little bit of glue. I feel pretty confident that we have this exactly where we need it. Now the glue is going to add strength. The problem is if you mess up and you have it glued together it's going to be very difficult to get apart. You're most likely going to break it all apart and not have any good pieces when you're done. So if you're worried about mistakes, things like that, we could just screw this together and it should be adequate enough because it will get glued on to the project. But if you're totally confident, you measured right, you double checked your measurements, you did a dry fit, all that, then go ahead and add a little bit of glue. It's not going to take much, just a little dab will do here. So I'm just going to put just a little dab between those two holes. Not that much, because when it pushes together, it's going to smear out there. And I don't want any ugly messes on my inside corner. When I put this together, I don't want any ugly glue messes on my inside corner. I'm going to line this up so it's nice and flush on the ends. So I'm looking that these two are nice and even. And then I'm going to take my face frame clamp and put it right over that joint. So once I'm even, and I'm still feeling this to make sure that end is even, and then I'm going to clamp it down when I'm happy with it. Now I'm going to take my driver. I have a 6-inch long driver on here, and the reason for that is I want my drill or my screw to go in as parallel as possible to the workpiece. If I had a short screwdriver or driver bit on there, my drill would have to be up at an angle more. So the longer the bit, that allows us to lay closer to the surface of the material and get that screw in there more parallel to the surface. So I'm going to take a screw. You can set the clutch of the drill down if you would like, so you don't strip out the screw. And I'm going to just kind of short little burst. Get that in till it snugs up. Okay? Now so I've put my screw in this first hole towards the inside of the project. I need to put a screw in this outside hole. Now sometimes what will happen, because the end of the material is here, it's starting to get weak, it's not supported. If I go and drive a screw into there, sometimes it will split the end of this wood. Okay, so what we can do to prevent that is we have an aircraft bit where we could take this and drive this bit. It's just a small drill bit that's super long, a 6-inch long bit. We can drive this in as parallel to the surface here and do a little pre-drill down into this piece so we don't crack. Now this isn't a solution all the time that works. Sometimes it doesn't work. But most of the time it does help relieve that pressure. But just know that it could still crack on you. So again, I'm trying to keep this drill as parallel to the surface. I'm going to fit down into that step hole that's in there, and then I'm going to go ahead and drill it out a little bit. Not much pressure. I don't want to break the bit. I'm just trying to relieve some of that pressure that's in there. Okay? And now when we drive that screw in, we should not crack or break the end of the board. So let's drive that screw in. And again, as I'm driving in, I like to use short little bursts rather than set the clutch low. I like to just short little trigger bursts, because then I can feel when it gets tightened up. Okay, I felt it tighten up. Now that we got that in there secure, we can take this clamp off. We only need to use one face frame clamp at a time. And hopefully when we're done, if we examine the other side, we should have a nice tight fitting joint. If there's a little bit of a gap in there on one side or the other, we could take and tighten that up again. We could take our board, lay it out, and take our bit and just try to snug that up a little bit to make sure that it does not come out. Now oftentimes we're using these smaller diameter screws. They are face frame screws. If this strips out on you, I have a screw of the same length but in a bigger diameter. And if that won't hold because you stripped out the hole, I do have a 1/2 inch longer screw or 1/4 inch longer screw that we could use in that bigger diameter. So usually we start with that black one, then we move to the same size, same length in the bigger diameter, then we go to the longer one in the bigger diameter if it's not holding on you. And you'll know when you go to tighten it up, if it just wants to spin and won't tighten up, you'll know that it's stripped out. All right, now I'm going to turn my face frame around. I like to do my ends first, and then I'll come back and position that one. So I'm going to put this this one is not gonna matter too much because we're gonna end up shaving off this a little bit, but we're gonna put this just like our other pieces with the X towards the center of the project. So it's gonna go in here just like this. Again, when we talk about being flush or even, we're looking for this joint to be nice and perfectly flush across the end. There's no bump there. Now that's not a measurable distance most of the time, so you're using your thumb or your finger to feel that, and if it's off, you'll feel it with your fingers, and so then you'll just adjust it. Make sure you take the time to adjust the clamp now, because once that glue sets, you're not going to get it apart. So go ahead. Again, I'm comfortable that this is right. I'm going to put a little dab of glue in here. Doesn't take a lot. Okay. I'm going to line up my edges so they're flush. We just talked about what flush meant, or even. And I'm going to take my face frame clamp and start to clamp that down. And as I'm squeezing, I haven't locked it, but I'm squeezing it, I'm making sure that that joint end is flush right there on the end. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to clamp it. Okay, and now we're good to start putting our screws in. So I'm going to take my black screws, load it on my drill, and I'm going to start getting that in there and tighten together. Okay, so when I tightened that up and I got tight, not only did I feel the extra tension on the bit, but I noticed this gap in here closed up. So that's a good indicator as well that we're tight, is that that gap has closed. So I'm going to take another screw and I'm going to do the top hole. And we're going to put the last one in. And I can feel that that bit is got some rounded corners. When we unclamp it and take a look at the front side, hopefully we have a nice tight joint all the way across there. If it's not nice and tight and the screws are tight though, it might be that it moved away from the fence on you when you were cutting. And so that edge is not truly 90 degrees, and that's why there's a gap in there. So I've got my top rail and my bottom rail connected. Now we need to do the center rail. And if I look in here, my center rail should be positioned so I have a 6-inch opening. 6 inches is kind of a standard size of top drawers in like your kitchen cabinets. You could have made this whatever you want on your project plans, but for this project we're doing 6 inches. So we could either measure 6 from this rail here, or we could go 7.5 to the very outside of the project, whatever you would like to do. I'm going to make a pencil mark on my face frame. So I'm going to take my face frame, I'm going to pull out my tape measure and use my pencil at 7.5 inches, because I am measuring from the outside edge. So 7.5 inches. Okay, and that little mark there is going to help. That little mark there is going to help me line this up when I clamp it down. It's not much, it's just a little pencil mark. Now I can verify that that's right by taking my tape measure and now butting it up in here, and I should be at the 6-inch mark. Okay, so because I want a 6-inch opening when I am done. Now that I've got that marked, I'm going to go ahead and line everything up and clamp it in place. This one's a little bit more tricky because we have to get the clamp way in here. So I'm going to get my rail ready. I'm going to move my face frame to a point where I can get my clamp in there and still clamp it down to that scrap piece. So when I've got that to a point where I feel comfortable, Okay, I'm going to put a little dab of glue on the face frame. Remember, not a lot, just a little dab will do. And I'm going to put my jointed edge towards the bottom opening, and it helps to put my glue in there on the right side. Now I'm going to take my clamp and manipulate it in there, and I want to still see this pencil mark here. If I can't see my pencil mark, I might need to adjust the clamp. I want to be able to make sure I can still visually see that, and then I'm going to clamp it down nice and tight to the workpiece. Now I did lose sight of my mark, but before I put my screws in, I can verify that by taking my tape measure and holding it up against here. Now I've moved, I'm off just ever so slightly. I need to go a little bit bigger, so now I'll reposition my clamp, move that down. Again, we want to do this before the glue sets and before you put screws in. Once we drive a screw in, we're not going to be able to do fine adjustments because the screw is going to follow the old screw hole. So now I got that ready. I'm going to take my face frame, screws, and attach this to this side. Down in there. Okay, you can hear the clutch giving out a little bit. This clutch got bumped down on me. Again, that's up to you. If you want to turn that clutch down so you can just give it full throttle all the way in there, that's fine. I like to have the torque all the way up and just do short little bursts. Until it tightens up. So now we'll undo this clamp and take a look at that joint. Looks pretty good, nice and tight there. So that is half of our face frame put together. We're going to now attach this other stile. So I'm going to start down here on the big end on the floor, and I'm going to get my stile. Remember, my jointed edge that I created is going to be towards the inside of the project. So that will allow me less sanding later on. If I put that X towards the inside of the project, I'll have to do less sanding later. Okay, so now I'm going to put a little glue on my rail. Doesn't take a lot. I need to get my end all flush down here, nice and even. As I tighten my clamp, I'm going to verify that it stays nice and flush. So I'm squeezing the clamp and feeling with my thumb, and when I got it flush, I'm going to clamp it, and then we're going to drive the screws in. Okay. So now we got the bottom rail attached. We're going to flip this over here, and I'm going to try to separate this a little bit and get some glue on these two rails while this bottom side is connected. Now mine has a little bit of a warp to it right now, so I've got a gap there, but sometimes you may have that nice and tight and it won't pull tight. So I'm going to just separate these the best I can without breaking anything and put a little dab of glue on each one. Remember, a little dab will do. So because I've got this warp in the board, I've got a gap here that I'm going to have to try to pull tight while getting everything flush. I'm going to use a clamp. This time I'm just going to use a little trigger clamp because this will reach across here. And I'm going to suck that in, and then I'm going to make sure that we're nice and flush on the end. And I'm going to take my face frame clamp to fine tune this and to push it into place and clamp it nice and flush. So my end is nice and flush now. It's pulled in so I don't have to force it in, and now I can drive my screws in. And now that should stay in place when I take my clamps off. Now what we need to do is get this center rail lined up. And so I'm going to use my tape measure and make sure that my opening on the left side and the right side is the same, so my drawer opening is not slanted. And I'm going to have to position my piece so I can get my face frame clamp in there. And I'm going to take my time and just do a couple measurements to make sure that we are nice and straight. And then I'm going to take my face frame clamp and get in there and clamp it to the table. And I'm gonna verify that since I clamped it, nothing moved on me. Once you've taken the time to do that, then go ahead and drive your screws in. Okay, and now we should be done with our face frame. We have it assembled. So there's our face frame all assembled. Yours might look a little different. Maybe you have a center stile in here, or maybe you have some more rails in this. It doesn't matter what it looks like, but this would be how we assemble the project. Now what we're gonna do is take this and clean up any of our joints. So we want the front to be nice and flush. We want to get rid of this red paint. We want our joints to be nice and even and clean from any glue. And we're going to do that at our wide belt sander. So let's go over to our wide belt sander and take a look. So we're going to use our wide belt sander to sand this to size. We need to first measure how thick it is. And I'm going to take a measurement at a joint where our pieces might be offset from each other. So we're going to look, and if any of our joints are offset, they're not nice and flush, then that's where we want to measure to get our thickness. And so we're going to use our caliper here on our joint. Make sure your caliper zeroes out before you use it, and then you can pull it open, and we're going to measure right across our thickest joint here. So we're measuring on both boards to get the biggest size. So if I look, I'm about 0.95 according to our dial caliper. So 0.95 is where we're going to set the machine. So we're going to come over here and turn the machine on. We got to do the main control. We've got to start the main start here button. Turn that on. You'll notice our lights start to indicate. So we're going to turn the machine on to 0.95. I'm going to hit program. 0.95, enter. So I've entered my size. That's the top number. The bottom number is the size the machine is actually at. So now you can see the blue start button is blinking. I'm going to hit that and it's going to move up. So 0.95, our actual size and our set size are the same size. Now we're gonna run this through the machine. We're gonna clean up both sides. We're gonna sand the front and back. That way when our back here gets put onto the cabinet, it sits nice and flush. So mainly, again, what we're looking for is nice, even joints, that our joints are not offset from each other. Okay, that it's nice and flush and even. So generally we leave this about as big as we can so that we have more material to work with. As we attach drawer slides and guides and hinges, we have more meat of the material here to work with. So really what we're just trying to do is clean it up. Generally speaking, this is going to stay thicker than 7/8 of an inch. So per the manufacturer's recommendation, we're going to be taking off 1/100 of an inch per pass. So we have our tens, hundredths, thousandths. We're going to take off 1/100 of an inch per pass. So if our first set is 950, our next pass would be 940 and then 930. Now again, the easiest way to set this once you have it set up is when you want to raise the table up, you just push the decimal button and start, and the machine is going to automatically adjust to the next size up, moving 1/100 of an inch per pass. Now if you need to adjust a smaller amount, maybe you want to take off 5/1000 of an inch per pass, maybe it's hitting the belt really hard and it's a really wide piece, then you can enter it in as described earlier in the safety demonstration, or you can use the up-down controls over on the side to fine-tune that. But we're going to take off 1/100 of an inch per pass, and I'm going to be using that decimal there, start, each time, and it's going to raise it up 1/100 of an inch for me each pass, or 10/1000 of an inch, however you want to say that. So we've got the machine set. We're going to turn it on now. I'm going to turn the brake off. I'm going to start the machine, and I'm going to turn the dust system on. So as I'm sanding my face frame, the sander is going to be rotating and spinning around. So it's going to be sanding with the grain on my stiles, and on the rails, it's going to be scratching against the grain. So each one of our rails is going to have what's called cross grain. And cross grain, if we take a closer look here, is going to be the scratches that are created from the machine going against the grain. And you can see them there. They're quite visible because of the heavy sandpaper. If we shine a little extra light, it might help them stick out a little bit. If you don't take care of these, the finish, when you apply a finish, it's going to magnify those defects and they're going to be very noticeable. So at this time, this is where I like to take an orbital sander and sand the face frame and get all those cross grains out. Now, this isn't going to be the only time that we sand the face frame. I'll end up sanding it again before finish, but this way I don't forget about those cross grain scratches in all of my rails. So we're here at the downdraft table. We're going to use an orbital sander to sand all of our face frame. In reality, the back side does not need to be done because that's going to be against the cabinet. The only time you would ever see that is if you flip the cabinet upside down. You might see it on the bottom side. Or if you stuck your head in the cabinet and looked back towards the front, you might see some cross grain. Really not concerned about the back side. What we're concerned about is the front visible side. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I have a little light here to help me see that scratches as I'm sanding. It might not help you in the video, but it's going to help me identify those scratches and make sure they're all gone. So first thing we're going to do is check our sandpaper, make sure it's in good condition. This one looks pretty used. There's actually buildup of clear coat around here. So if we were to use this, these swirl marks from this clear coat would appear. So we're going to change this out and get a better piece of sandpaper that doesn't have all this buildup on there. So just throw that away when you're done. In the top upper drop down bin, that's where we keep our sandpaper so that the dust does not stick to the roll. If we had these laying out, the fine powdery dust would accumulate on this roll and then the next one would not be sticky. So put it back in the drop down bin and make sure the bin is shut. Spread out the sticker and line up your sander and tap it down a little bit. You should be good to go. So let's go ahead and get this sanded. Check the cord, make sure it's in good condition, plug it in, turn the table on, and we're going to sand away. So my sandpaper keeps ripping because it's catching the edge of the board as I'm sanding and it's tearing off little shreds of sandpaper. So if your sandpaper becomes bad or you got the black pad exposed, you may have to change that out. Hopefully it doesn't catch too much on those sharp edges of your board. So if we look closer at these two, you can see this rail still has those cross grain marks on it. And this rail that's been sanded, the majority of them are gone. There's still a little bit right in this area. So we need a little bit more focus on those. So a little bit more sanding left to do. I'm going to turn the face frame around because I like to hold on to the workpiece with my left hand. And I don't want to sand too close to my left hand. I'm going to throw this old pad away so it's out of our way. So if we take a look at our three rails, they have all been sanded and that cross grain should all be removed from those. Now that cross grain is something very easy that you as the creator, the builder, can get out. And so that's something that actually when we grade your project, you're graded pretty heavily on, is the sanding of the project. I understand sometimes the construction might have some defects, things like that. But on things like pencil marks and things like cross grain that you could have just sanded. There's not really much skill to get that out of there. That has a higher weight on some of the grading aspects than the things that maybe were a little bit more difficult. So we want to make sure we take the time to sand this. You'll also notice as I was sanding, I didn't just sand the rails, I sanded all of the face frame. So I didn't leave any rough spots, I didn't create any gouges where I spent my time sanding. The whole thing got sanded. So at this point, we're going to set the face frame aside and we're going to start building the box or the case of the project.